Arghiri Emmanuel. Myths of Development vs. Myths of Underdevelopment. 61. Bill Warren's article Imperialism and Capitalist Industrialization in NLR 81 is a very important text, although I believe his fundamental line of argument to be misconceived. There is no doubt that he draws attention to many aspects of the vexed question of development in the Third World that are too often ignored, by Marxists as well as by bourgeois economists. However, some of his theses are perhaps less surprising than he imagines. Warren's insistence upon the relatively high industrialization rates experienced in recent decades by underdeveloped countries is certainly no great shock to the present writer. In my book Unequal Exchange, I give due acknowledgement to the recent wave of industrialization in the Third World and to the fact that annual growth rates of industrial production in some of these countries are higher than those prevailing in the advanced countries themselves, higher than had ever been known before. Bill Warren is also quite correct to attack the ambiguities in current left analyses conceived of in terms of dependence, backwardness, and underdevelopment, understood not simply as a quantitative gap but as an undefined qualitative distortion. On this point I would indeed go somewhat further than Warren and add that the concept of domination which he accepts is no less elusive than that to which he takes exception, as soon as direct colonial rule is no longer involved. If it is not specified whether it is political domination which entails economic domination or the other way round, reference to it involves familiar circular reasoning. In the peripeteia of the recent oil crisis and the inglorious response of some of the imperialist powers to this major challenge to their most vital interests, with their representatives queuing up in the anterooms of the Middle Eastern princes, it would not be difficult to find empirical material for an article no less iconoclastic than that of Warren. It is certainly the case that current left literature underestimates the significance of formal independence, of economic, I would even say of political nationalism, and of the ability of small countries, and of some rightist regimes of the periphery to avail themselves of inter-imperialist rivalries and to get the best out of capitalist bargaining, up to and including the use of punitive actions against foreign companies. It is also quite true that current left-wing criticism does not distinguish clearly between development within the framework of capitalism on the one hand, and socialist revolution, on the other. It denies any progress of the former just because of the absence of the latter. I expressed much the same view in my own book, pointing out the absurdity of blaming imperialism for not having betrayed its own principles and having promoted state planning and the socialist path of development, and for not having lavished all sorts of benefits on its victims to the overall improvement in the bargaining position of host countries vis-a-vis foreign resource companies, outlined by Warren is, of course, an obvious fact of the contemporary world, and it would need a rather large dose of dogmatism to remain unaware of it. Moreover, the conventional argument that underdeveloped countries suffer from the implantations of unsuitable, excessively labor-saving technology is not only a gratuitous assertion, as Warren rightly observes, but constitutes an unconscious reinstatement of the basic neoclassical theory of the international division of labor, that of Hector Olin, and the crudest rejection of the traditional Marxist position on this issue. For bourgeois doctrine has always taught that each country specializes in those branches, and chooses those techniques within these branches, which make the most use of its most abundant factor assumed to be also the cheapest one, thus bringing about a maximization of its own output and an optimization of the international division of labor. Marxists have always contended that it is indeed by so doing that free enterprise blocks development in undeveloped and consequently low-wage countries, since it relegates them to the ghetto of labor-intensive production techniques, that is, production with the lowest technology and productivity, which, in their turn, keep wages low and reproduce the same conditions. But today, all of a sudden, socialists blame multinational corporations for breaking this vicious circle of the specific imperialist international division of labor, by doing exactly the opposite, introducing into cheap labor countries labor-saving plant and processes. I doubt whether multinational corporations have really adopted such uncapitalist behavior on any significant scale. If, by any chance, they were to do so, their practice would constitute an unexpected proof of Warren's belief in the self-destructive character of imperialism. So far as the dependence of the Third World in general on foreign technology of any kind is concerned, I would argue that under present circumstances, where the cultural infrastructure in capitalist countries is financed by the state and put free of charge at the disposal of scientific research, indigenous technology costs too much to be preferable, whereas licenses and patents are one of the rare categories of goods imported by underdeveloped countries, perhaps the only one, which are artificially undervalued, insofar as part of their cost of production is defrayed by the seller's state. Finally, I myself do not equate debt with a debt problem and even less with a draining of surplus from the periphery to the center, so I find Warren's comments on this subject very sensible indeed. In some cases, debt must be equated with a draining of surplus in the opposite direction, from the creditor to the debtor. This is currently the case of eurodollars, which represent a huge volume of real value supplied to the United States by the rest of the world, against an American debt. To be sure, the underdeveloped countries do not have the same power as the United States of monetizing their debt more plainly, of not servicing it, but in a period when all currencies are losing between 5 and 10% of their value each year, I would strongly recommend any individual or any state to run into debt up to the extreme limit of their lender's readiness to oblige, notwithstanding any apprehension about future servicing. The fetish of industrialization, however, despite these merits, Warren has attempted to prove too much. On the assumption that development implies industrialization, he jumps to the unwarranted conclusion that industrialization and development are one and the same thing. It follows that the same data lead Warren and myself in two opposite directions. The very fact that manufacturing labor and manufacturing output, as percentages of total labor force and total output, are roughly the same in Argentina as in USA, 25.1% and 28% as against 26.5% and 28%, and considerably higher than that, 41.4% and 38%, in Hong Kong, proves in my view that mere industrialization is by itself not a good gauge of development, for it would logically compel Warren to admit that Argentina is as highly developed as the USA, and Hong Kong 50% more so. 3. I have explained at length, in an appendix to my book Unequal Exchange, my own view of the prevalent confusion between industrialization and mechanization, and shall not go over these arguments afresh. It can be said, however, that if we really want to demystify the concept of economic development, we must, first and foremost, acknowledge that the only conceivable purpose of development is to improve men's material well-being, and that it is only on this account that it is of interest to economists. Industrialization, manufacture, mechanization and so forth, can only be means to attaining this end, and it would be absurd and ridiculous to regard them as ends in themselves. Leaving aside the questions involving choice of lifestyle, what is currently called the quality of life, this improvement in well-being must mean a quantitative increase in consumption of goods and services of all kinds. Since this increase must in turn affect a certain number of individuals, and be accompanied within capitalist relations of production by a certain diffusion of consumption, which reinforces the significance of averages, and since we are not concerned with development in general, but with capitalist development, the most reliable and direct measurement of it, which is at the same time the simplest and easiest, is GNP per head of population. Wiseacres like to quote against this criterion the example of Kuwait, a country that is regarded as underdeveloped despite its $4,000 GNP per head of population before the increase in oil royalties, perhaps $10 now. But even if this objection were well founded, I should not alter my definition. For even if it broke down in the case of Kuwait, it would still be less bad than any of those that are offered in its stead, less bad, for example, than a definition which, on the basis of the relative growth of manufactures, makes Portugal, Chile, Mexico, Iran, Singapore, Ecuador or Malta, countries that are more highly developed than Greece, and Spain a country nearly as highly developed as Australia and New Zealand. It would be less bad, too, than a definition which, on the basis of their exports of primary products, makes Holland, Denmark, Sweden, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and even the USA, countries less highly developed than Japan. It is certainly less bad than a definition which uses the concept of domination by foreign capital in general, and multinational corporations in particular, to make Canada the least highly developed country in the world, because it is the one most dominated by foreign-owned firms, and India the most highly developed country in the world because there is less foreign investment there than anywhere else. In fact, however, the Kuwaiti objection is not well founded. It neither contradicts nor weakens a definition of development based on the GNP, for the simple reason that neither the citizens of Kuwait nor even its emir actually appropriate this GNP. They allow the greater part of it to become merely so many book entries in the banks of Zurich or London, which, in the long run, is just to make a gift of it to foreigners. Let us assume, however, that a government were established in Kuwait tomorrow which decided to take possession of this income in real values, something that obviously could be done only by importing equivalent commodities, in goods and services, into Kuwait itself, and that by so doing it automatically transformed the country's 700,000 inhabitants into idle rentiers on a grand scale, that it provided every family with a luxurious villa, and that, in addition to the desirable number of cars, refrigerators, and television sets per head, this complete welfare state used its immense income in order to introduce free, compulsory education up to the age of 30, turning all Kuwaitis, men and women alike, into holders of university degrees, that it trained or imported a doctor for every 300 persons and installed a hospital bed for every 100, that, finally, it imported some tens of thousands of German governesses for the country's children, and the same number of well-trained West European maids and servants. Then, perhaps, although I might have some reservations about the morality of the society concerned, I should certainly refrain from classifying it as underdeveloped, and neither the absence of the smoke, noise, and pollutant waste products of manufacturing industry nor of an adequate technology would cause me to modify my view. But not all countries can by natural endowment dispose of a volume of royalties so disproportionate to their population as to enable them to live without working and consume without producing. As a rule they can consume only what they produce, or what they receive in exchange for what they produce. Now, the ratio between the number of producers and the number of consumers is not easy to alter. For a certain number of mouths to be fed, a human community has at its disposal only a certain number of pairs of hands. Unlike other factors of production, labor is biologically limited. The consequence is that, in order to increase the amount consumed by each mouth, it is necessary to increase the product of each pair of hands, in a given unit of time, in other words, to increase the productivity of labor, which thus becomes the only relevant magnitude, as well as the essential problem of economic development. We have then only to reflect that an increase in the productivity of labor can be attained by two means alone, namely, by making a larger quantity of instruments of production available to the worker, or else by increasing his degree of skill in order to perceive that the driving forces of development are mechanization and education, the replacement of hands by machines and of muscles by brains. Industry, agriculture, and capacity for mechanization. All the foregoing is commonplace. The complications begin after this theoretical point has been reached. Dazzled by the fact that it is industry that produces machines and stimulates the training of brains, many economists have lost sight of the fact that it is not the production of machines in certain specific branches that increases productivity, leads to technical training of workers, and eventually brings abundance, but the utilization of machines and technicians in any branch whatsoever. All branches have not, of course, the same capacity for absorbing machines and brains, and, as a result, a choice between them has to be made in deciding on a strategy of development. But while it is the sector of manufacturing industry that produces machines, it is not necessarily the branches of this sector that possess the greatest potential for utilization of machines and technicians. In agriculture, stock breeding, fishing, mining, and even in the tertiary sector, there are branches which have a greater capacity for absorbing machinery and engineers, and so, capital and skilled labor than is possessed by certain branches of manufacturing industry. This will be reflected in output per head of person employed, since it is this output that rewards the capital and skilled labor engaged in production. Consequently, when Warren speaks of the transference of active population from backward agriculture to modern industry, he is begging the question. Quite simply, he forgets that there is also modern agriculture and backward industry. If he had taken this into account, he would have interpreted his own figures differently. According to these figures, in 1959 the underdeveloped countries produced a total value of $27.6 billion in manufacturing industry, since there were at that time about 46,600,000 persons engaged in manufacture in these countries. Output per person employed was $592.5. Here we really see backward industry, since in the same period the average product per person employed in the countries of the OECD was $3.760, and in the USA $7.180. Also in the same period the average product per person employed in agriculture in the principal OECD countries was $1.860, and in the USA $3.638. There we see modern agriculture 6. If we leap forward about a decade and take the year 1970, we observe that the gap between the modern agriculture of one group of countries and the backward industry of the other has widened instead of diminished. To be sure, the product per person engaged in manufactures in the Third World has made some progress, increasing from $592 to $994 in current prices, but the product per person engaged in agriculture in the advanced countries has risen from $1.800 to $4.488, and in North America from $3.638 to $8.095. In constant prices, the productivity of labor in manufactures in the Third World has increased from index 100 to index 129, while the productivity of labor in agriculture in the OECD countries as a whole has increased from 100 to 185, and in the USA from 100 to 171. As for the productivity of labor in manufactures in the advanced countries, this has increased in the same period from 100 to 160. 7. Clearly, therefore, it is not by transferring its factors from agriculture to industry that a country develops, but by mechanizing and modernizing both of these sectors. The superiority of the OECD countries over the Third World does not consist in the larger share occupied by manufacture in their national production, but in the fact that both their manufactures and their agriculture are on a far higher level than those of the Third World. Two types of manufactures. The frontier of development does not run between agriculture and manufactures, but between two totally different forms of these two activities. Terms of comparison more real than monetary indices may perhaps serve better to bring out the difference between the two forms. Out of every 100 persons engaged in industry in 1960 there were in the three most populous countries of the Third World, India, Pakistan, and Indonesia, only 45 wage earners in the first, 36 in the second and 44 in the third, as against 95 in the USA, 92 in Western Germany, and 98 in Britain. Warren repeatedly writes of an expansion of capitalist relations of production. In my view, it is difficult to describe as capitalist the development of a sector where, in the countries mentioned, there was less than one wage earner per enterprise, as against 19 to 49 in really advanced countries. 8. For Warren has overlooked the point that manufacturing industry includes craft production, or else, perhaps, he thought that the latter was relatively negligible. In point of fact, the OECD study already cited gives the relevant figures for Latin America. In this region, which is not the least developed of the Third World, and where the proportion of wage earners among persons engaged in industry lies somewhere between the proportion in the three Asian countries and the three OECD countries mentioned above, ranging between 72% in Colombia and 84% in Mexico, the proportion of craft production, listed as such in these statistics, amounts to 44.2% of the total employment credited to the rubric manufactures 9. It can thus be seen that the manufacturing industry of which Warren makes so much, is only half industrial, the other half being pre-capitalist craft production, which accounts for the fact that, altogether, there are more employers and self-employed than wage earners in it. Another term of comparison, a physical one, so to speak, between the two types of manufacture is the quantity of energy consumed by the one and the other. This is also, in a sense, the most direct gauge, since it shows us the degree to which man makes nature contribute to his productive effort, and so the true degree of development of the productive forces and, consequently, of development itself. The general average of energy consumption in the Third World as a whole, in coal equivalent, was 520 kilograms per head of population in 1971, as against 11,059 in the USA. For the advanced countries, the approximate share of energy consumed in industry is usually estimated at 40% of the total. For the underdeveloped countries there are neither statistics nor official estimates, but the OECD experts have the impression that the proportion taken by industry must be less. Nevertheless, so as to avoid any underestimation that might unduly strengthen my argument, I will assume the proportion to be the same 40%. Consequently, the energy consumed by industry in coal equivalent, per person employed in industry, was 133 kilograms in the Third World in 1971, as against 37,670 kilograms in the USA. 10. Two types of agriculture. We have already seen that the difference in output between a mechanized and a non-mechanized agriculture is considerably greater than that between an agriculture and a manufacture, neither of which is highly mechanized or advanced. To take an extreme case, if the Third World were to give up agriculture completely and transfer all its employed population into manufactures of the same type that it possessed in 1959, which Warren invokes, it would advance only from $140 to $244 in its GNP per head, and would still be very far from crossing the threshold of development, whereas if, by some miracle, it had been able in 1959 to modernize its agriculture up to the North American level, it would, by concentrating in that sector, the whole of its employed population, have advanced from $140 to $1,370 per head, which was, at that time, the average level in the OECD countries. This is, of course, just a hypothesis of pure theory. In impure reality it is not possible to mechanize a country's agriculture without industrializing it to some extent at the same time. Consequently, economic development is accompanied by a certain transfer of active population from agriculture to industry. Between these two phenomena, however, there is no linear causal relation, but only concomitance. Industrialization is not the structural condition for development, but its syndrome. In other words, the transfer from agriculture to industry does not take place because agriculture is backward in itself, and industry advanced in itself, but quite simply because the spectrum of industrial goods is so much wider than that of agricultural products, and the proportion they represent in the housewife's shopping basket is such an increasing function of the rise in the standard of living that, given the rigidities of external trade and certain minimum dimensions of the country concerned, the outlets for agriculture are soon saturated. Let us assume that the other economic activities of the USA produced less value per person employed than its agriculture, that the rest of the world agreed to give up its own agriculture completely and import from the USA all the agricultural products it needed, supplying the USA in exchange with all the industrial goods that country wanted, that natural factors such as cultivable land were unlimited in the USA, that the transfer of equipment and personnel from one sector to the other presented no problem, and that transport costs were nil. It would still nevertheless be impossible for the USA to profit from this situation and specialize 100% in agriculture, for the simple reason that the 80 million employed Americans, working in an agriculture as productive as theirs is, would produce a volume of agrarian products more than twice what is at present consumed by the entire population of our planet. It is thus not because agriculture is backward that men leave it, but, on the contrary, because it is relatively too productive in relation to the scale of existent needs. What development presupposes is not industrialization but, first and foremost, an increase of productivity in agriculture such that those who remain in it can feed those who leave it. 11. As with manufactures, so in this case, a comparison in physical terms is most eloquent. Employing certain coefficients of conversion of elaborated calories into direct calories, and making other extremely minute calculations, Paul Barrick has perfected an index of productivity based on net physical production per male employed person, unity being equal to 1 million of these direct calories per annum. He arrives at the following results. In the light of the above, we can observe another bias in Bill Warren's statistics. The workers who leave agriculture during a process of development do not all go into industry, as he seems to suppose. A substantial section go into the tertiary sector. This means that the most significant indicator is not the number of employed persons who arrive. 69. Average production in direct calories per annum per male employed person 1960 to 4 1810 1840 all underdeveloped countries 5 2 of which Africa 4 9 Latin America 13 0 Latin America less Argentina 9 1 Asia 4 6 France 60 0 7 0 USA 180 0 21 5 UK 14 0 Germany 7 5 Belgium 10 0. In manufactures, but the number who remain in agriculture. The only figures that are missing in Warren's statistics are precisely those that would show this. Seen in the light of the first indicator, the situation in 1970 does not seem very dramatic. Manufacturing labor force as percent of total population. OECD countries 28.5. Rest of the world 10.0. Seen in the light of the second indicator, however, the distance between the two categories of country is much bigger, and it is evolving in a way that is absolutely unfavorable to the Third World. Agricultural labor force as percent of total active population 1960 1966 1970 13 advanced countries 19 1 14 1 11 6 underdeveloped countries 77 69 5 68 7. Statistics and projections. It may perhaps be objected that the foregoing argument is beside the point, because it matters little whether industrialization is the motor of development or merely its corollary, once I agree that development is indissociable from it, and because even if the manufacturing industry already installed in the Third World is not very productive, it nevertheless constitutes an advance on the other economic activities, which are even less so. While this industry produces only $592 per head of employed population, these other activities produce only $340. While, therefore, modern agriculture is superior to backward industry, the latter is nevertheless superior to backward agriculture. Moreover, this superiority is accurately reflected in the evolution of GNP in the Third World, which I accept as the most reliable indicator of overall development. My reply to this is as follows. If we were concerned merely to record the statistical fact of a certain advance already achieved by the underdeveloped countries, the theoretical distinctions I have made would indeed be futile hair-splittings. But I am assuming that this is not what interests us, that what we seek to discover is whether future development of the Third World is possible along the capitalist road, or whether this road is, in fact, blocked. In order to do this, it is not enough to juxtapose phenomena in statistical terms, we have to organize them in a network of precise determinations. Accordingly, I have 2 points to make to Bill Warren. The first relates to the correctness of his interpretation of the statistical data, and the second to the forces at work behind these data. 1. Warren notes that the rate of growth of the total product of the underdeveloped countries exceeded, in the period 1951 to 69, that of the advanced countries. True, he says, per capita this rate does lag behind that of the imperialist world, in part because of the unprecedented post-war rates of population growth in the former. But, he adds, growth per head is an extremely demanding criterion of performance, and he concludes that it is total growth rather than growth per head that is what is at issue in our controversy. I wonder if Warren has not fallen into a statistical snare here? He seems to forget that the additional population consists not merely of consumers, but also of producers. Depending on the differential mortality rate per age group, it is indeed possible for an increase in the rate of demographic growth to be accompanied by a certain decline in the proportion of active persons in the total population. But this decline is not cumulative. It needs to be reckoned with only once at the moment when the rate of demographic growth changes. Once this rate has become stabilized, the number of active persons will increase year by year in the same proportion as the total population, and variations in product per head of population will thereafter faithfully reflect those in product per head of employed persons, the latter being the true index of the development of the forces of production. 14. Seen from this angle, the situation in the Third World is far from brilliant. The difference in levels was thus 1.6 in I-900, it had widened to 1.13.2 by 1970. Here it is indeed hard to discern the significant and continuing reduction of inequality that Warren observes 15.2. This disparity in the respective growth rates per head of population carries with it some very important implications, insofar as, if I am right, the main obstacle to the development of the Third World countries lies neither in a peculiarity of their own social structure nor in a deliberate strategy of the great powers or of big capital, but in the free working of market forces. GNP per head of population of the non-communist countries, in constant 1953 $16 underdeveloped countries, advanced countries, absolute values growth rate 1970 43%, 420, 108% 1952 100, 875, 1958 114 115, 1965 100, and 29 44% 1510 117% 1970 144 903 for the whole 70 years 106% 353%. 4. In the capitalist world, in which all the natural functions of human society are stood on their heads, the primary problem being not to produce but to sell, he who dominates is not the biggest producer but the biggest consumer, and it does not matter much whether or not the difference in consumption is reinforced by a demographic imbalance. Little Denmark possesses neither a predominant production of a particular commodity, nor a national technology that is exclusive in some domain, nor a particularly powerful finance capital, nor, finally, military strength of any significance. What it does possess is a domestic market as big as all those of the Arab countries of North Africa, plus Saudi Arabia, put together. That is enough for it to be a parasitic capitalist country which exploits the underdeveloped countries. This may seem paradoxical, as though we were saying that it is the possibility of clearing the estuary of a river that determines the volume of its tributaries. Yet it is so. Instead of consuming what it has already proved capable of producing, the capitalist system can produce and consequently, advance and develop only what it can sell, that is, only where there is an already available capacity for consumption, either actual or potential. This is, indeed, the most fundamental difference between the dynamic of capitalism and the dynamic of socialism. In the former, all the impulses come from the market, so that investment in capital goods becomes impossible at the very moment when demand for final goods recedes or stagnates. The world is turned upside down. What is downstream determines what is upstream. In the dynamic of socialism, production creates its own market. The world stands on its feet, and what is upstream supplies what is downstream. I do not intend to enlarge on this point here, but if we accept it, and stop looking for the causes of the blockage of the Third World's development in the functions of production or of technology, or in vague conspiracies hatched in chancelleries or boardrooms of multinational corporations, all the questions with which Bill Warren is concerned become much clearer. The case of oil. It may well be that the recent oil upheaval will help to demystify these matters. We can now see that the increase in the price of oil, and the fantastic profits made from it, will be largely illusory, manifested in mere alterations in book entries in banks in Zurich, London, and New York for lack of adequate structures for the absorption, and so for the consumption, of commodities and services that could be imported by the oil-producing countries. These structures of reception are, quite simply, domestic incomes, and in particular adequate wage levels, since, even if it is a question of importing capital goods, the latter will eventually lead to an increase in the production of consumer goods, and under the free enterprise system no entrepreneur is going to invest upstream of a branch when he has not already available, downstream, an outlet for the corresponding final product. 17. Thus, the rise in the price of oil will very probably remain formal, costing nothing to the consumer countries as a whole, 18, and bringing no profit to the producing countries. The latter will continue to receive, in real values, only the cost of production, some 10 or 20 cents per barrel, plus a very small additional part of the price, realized in the form of armaments, or of a few tankers and perhaps also some refineries. 73. Installed here and there. The rest of the price they will never receive, for lack of capacity to consume it. In other words, these countries, after having been for a long time too poor to be able to sell their oil at a normal price, when at last they have the opportunity to unite and, nominally, dictate this price, turn out to be too poor to be able to ensure that they are paid it in real terms. 19. Furthermore, the fact that the cost of production of oil in the Middle East continues to be between 10 and 20 cents a barrel today renders present prices very vulnerable. The least weakening of the Arab United Front will lead to their rapid collapse. The only force that could consolidate these prices durably would be an increase in the actual cost of extraction. Let us imagine that the recent price increases had been preceded by a wave of strikes in the Middle East which had resulted in a very substantial increase in wages. Let us further imagine that, as a consequence, there had followed a rapid economic development of these countries, and intense urbanization so that the price of a square meter of land in Saudi Arabia or Iraq had risen to the level of California or Texas, and that, as a result of all this, the real cost of extraction had risen from 10 cents to $10 a barrel. It is clear that nobody, in those circumstances, would have vociferated about blackmail. For this is the logic of capitalism: you can easily make the rest of the world pay for your wages and your consumption as previously established, that is, the prices of your factors of production, whatever these may be. You cannot, without problems and conflicts, make the rest of the world pay a price based on an exchange of equal quantities of such factors. The end of imperialism. In the light of the above, we can now tackle Bill Warren's principal conclusion, namely, that the flow of capital from the center to the periphery will cause, as with a pair of communicating vessels, the levels of development of center and periphery gradually to level up, and therewith imperialism itself to disappear. The notion of the diffusion of development by the movement of capital is one of the oldest theses of Marxism. 20. Nowadays, there will be many readers who will be shocked by it. I am not one of them. I have already said that I do not believe in mysterious baleful forces which confabulate in the boardrooms of great holding companies in order to enslave peoples. Here we have Canada, a country where it would be hard to find a single enterprise of any importance which is free from control by foreign capital, in this case US, and there we have India, where there is practically no foreign investment, and where industrialization has been conducted by a bourgeoisie as national as can be imagined. I must confess that I have never understood what Canadian workers or the Canadian people would gain if the decision-making centers of their industry and commerce were to be shifted from offices located in the skyscrapers of New York or Chicago to others located in the tower blocks of Montreal or Toronto, and still less have I ever understood what the Indian masses, with their income of $10 per capita per annum, would stand to lose if the day came when capitalists with Indian passports handed over to capitalists with North American or Japanese ones. Bill Warren is right. The mere arrival of foreign capital in a country does not block anything. It enslaves or develops the country just as much as any other capital, neither more nor less. Consequently, if it should happen that capital from New York were to flow into Calcutta as it flows into San Francisco, we should have no reason to suppose that Calcutta would not one day be, for better or worse, the equal of San Francisco. Unfortunately, and this is where Bill Warren's mistake begins, capital has never flowed into Calcutta, under present conditions it seems improbable, if not impossible, that it will flow into Calcutta in the future. Indeed, Calcutta is not underdeveloped because it has been invaded by foreign capital but, on the contrary, because it has been starved of this capital. I have already explained in New Left Review my own view of the myth of the export of capital from the center to the periphery, before Lenin, in Lenin's time, and since Lenin. 21. But Warren himself does not conceal the marginal character of the net inflow of foreign capital into the underdeveloped countries today. Quoting Mansur's figures, he shows that in 1964-8 the net inflow of foreign capital into Latin America, even though the multinational corporations show a special predilection for this continent, represented 13% of gross asset formation in this region, which is a derisory figure. This makes it even more surprising that he should adopt the position a few pages later, that this inflow justifies an optimistic assessment of the future growth of the underdeveloped countries. But the situation is even worse than is suggested by the percentage just mentioned, for it is not possible to calculate the true net inflow from the data directly contained in official statistics. To cite only one bias characteristic of these figures, let us here mention that the monetary holdings in dollars created in favor of non-residents are not reckoned in the deficit of the American balance of payments, and so in the rest of the world's surplus, unless they are credited in the accounts of the central banks of the other countries, that is, incorporated in their reserves. Let us take as example a U.S. engineer who pays his hotel bill at Abidjan with a $1,000 check drawn on a U.S. bank. If the hotel keeper refrains from selling this check to the central bank of the Ivory Coast, if he sends it to Switzerland, or even if he simply keeps it in his wallet, this outflow of capital from the Ivory Coast to the USA will not be recorded anywhere. On the other hand, if this engineer is engaged on some project in the Ivory Coast, and the expenses of his stay are paid by some international aid fund, these same $1,000 will be reckoned as part of the inflow of capital into Ivory Coast, although, so long as the check in question is not used in order to import a real value from the USA, nobody has aided anybody, the Ivory Coast having housed and fed the engineer from its own resources. When we think of the volume of transactions in dollars throughout the world, such as the payment of oil royalties in this currency, we can appreciate how serious this bias in the statistics really is. In fact, all the eurodollars held by residents of underdeveloped countries, whether oil-producing or not, represent such an outflow of capital which ought to be deducted from the most net possible inflow shown in the statistics. That is why I think that the most reliable method is to take as the overall balance of financial operations the inverse of the trade balance. Trade balance of the underdeveloped countries, in billion dollars: 22 1958 1966 1967 1968 1969 1970 1971 imports CIF 27 841 042 246 057 56 963 8 exports FOB 24 839 139 943 849 055 162 0 deficit 300.923221.71818. By reckoning, as in the above table, imports as CIF port of destination and exports as FOB port of departure, we credit the advanced countries with all transport, not merely between themselves as a whole and the underdeveloped countries as a whole, but also among the latter, since these figures are for the entire external trade of the Third World, from all sources and to all destinations. In other words, we assume that the underdeveloped countries possess absolutely no means of international transport, whether intercontinental or intracontinental, which is, of course, far from being the case. Since, moreover, transport, insurance and banking operations in external trade make up the bulk of the services provided by the advanced countries to the underdeveloped ones, the remainder of the invisible items, tourism, emigrants' remittances, etc., must be positive rather than negative for the underdeveloped countries. By ignoring these considerations and regarding the above figures as equivalent to the annual balances of every kind of the underdeveloped countries, we have thus reckoned in generous terms the financial inflow of every kind arriving from the advanced countries. This is the most reliable method of calculation since, if what we are trying to discover is the possible contribution made from external sources to the development of the Third World, it is as well to abandon the crazy dance of dollars, sterling, and francs, with its inextricable criss-crossings, and look directly at the material objects which move over the frontiers in both directions, since, our world being what it is, the development of a country can only be accomplished by means of material objects: steel, cement, coal, and nobody has yet seen wads of dollars, pounds or francs turn into railways, power dams, or factories. Now, as we see in the figures set out above, by broadly crediting the advanced countries with all the flows regarding which there is doubt or uncertainty, we arrive at a grand maximum total of external financing which is, on the average, less than $2 billion per annum, or about $2.50 per head of active population of the Third World, hardly the value of one screwdriver. At that rate it would take several thousand years to equip all the workers of the underdeveloped countries with means of production comparable to those of the present advanced countries, where the fixed capital per head of active population exceeds, on the average, $40,000 in the USA, and the gross formation of fixed capital per annum and per head of active population is, for example, $2.400 in West Germany, $2.250 in France, and $2.750 in Italy. 23. The impasse of development. So much for the past, but why have we reason to think that the future will see no improvement? Because of the very fact of the inequality of levels. Capital is not attracted by a low level, like the liquid in communicating vessels, but is, on the contrary, sucked up by a siphon effect, towards active markets and high levels of consumption. Apart from raw materials and certain agricultural products which have to be sought where they can be found, the movement of capital is not an increasing but a decreasing function of difference in incomes. It is here that we observe the limits to import substituting industrialization which Warren does not choose to acknowledge. The advanced countries are nowadays too rich not to be able to absorb themselves, without difficulty, all the new capital that is formed in them, and the underdeveloped countries are too poor to offer attractive investment prospects to this same capital, apart from their few import substitution industries. They are even so poor that they dispatch to Switzerland part of their own national surplus. All this, in turn, keeps them poor, or makes them even poorer. Imperialism is not self-destructive, it is self-reproducing. 24. It is, of course, true that despite this general deficiency, certain marginal movements of capital, concentrated for various reasons in some small country, such as Greece, Taiwan, or the Ivory Coast, may enable such a country to cross the threshold of development. Something like this happens inside a nation when a single proletarian succeeds, as an individual, in rising out of his class. But just as, whatever may happen in this way, capitalists are in no danger of waking up one fine morning to find that there are not enough proletarians left to operate their factories, so it seems materially out of the question for the 2 billion people in the periphery to follow the same path. It is because the other underdeveloped countries do not follow this path of ultra-liberal opening to international capital, that the few countries that do follow it have a chance, however slight this may be, of succeeding with it. The gap in physical terms. The impasse of development can be made brutally plain if it is translated into real terms. Some 6% of the world's population, the inhabitants of the USA, consume more than 40% of an available quantity of raw materials. An equalization of consumption to US levels implies, therefore, a more than six-fold multiplication, on average, of the present volume of extraction, assuming that the USA does not progress any further. Geologically and technically, a leap such as this is out of the question in the foreseeable future. The inhabitants of the USA consume nearly 700 kilograms of steel per head per annum. If the entire world followed their example, all our planet's known reserves of iron ore would be exhausted in 40 years, assuming that the world's population ceased to grow. Otherwise, exhaustion would occur in an even shorter space of time. The same equalization of international consumption would, furthermore, exhaust all known reserves of copper within 8 years, and of tin within 6 years. 25. But where the impasse is most complete is, once again, in the domain of oil. At present US levels of consumption, the world would need about 14 to 15 billion metric tons each year. But world reserves amount only to about 80 billion, which corresponds, given a stationary state of population and economic development, to 5.12 years of consumption. If we add reserves still to be discovered, or to be exploited by new technological inventions, we can reckon according to OECD calculations on twice this quantity, or about 160 billion metric tons, and so, given the same assumed state of stagnation, a period of 11 years before the end is reached. Finally, if we include the seabed potential throughout the world, some experts reckon that, given the most optimistic calculations and assumptions, we could count on 320 billion metric tons altogether, or 22 years consumption. But exhaustion of deposits and reserves is not the only factor that rules out equalization of consumption upwards. Ecological limitations represent another. If the advanced countries of today can still get rid of their waste by dumping it into the sea or allowing it to pass into the here, then, it is no longer a question of the abstract rhetoric of concepts surplus value, capital, profit, and so on, but of material consumption. It is therefore the great mass of the population of the advanced countries, the wage earners themselves, who are implicated. The consequence is that, regardless of any other consideration or antagonism, in the objective natural and technological conditions of today and of the foreseeable future, the peoples of the rich countries can consume all those articles to which they are so attached only because other peoples consume very few or even none of them. It is this that breaks solidarity between the working classes of the two groups of countries. We have today reached a point at which, equalization being impossible either downwards, for socio-political reasons, or upwards, for natural technical reasons, the only solution lies in a global change in the very pattern of living and consumption, and the very concept of well-being. Since the framework and parameters of this solution must be those of mankind as a whole, the contradictions between classes within the advanced countries, which still undoubtedly subsist, have nevertheless become historically secondary. The principal contradiction, and driving force for change, are henceforth located in the realm of international economic relations. Imperialism is certainly not indestructible. But nor is it withering away, as Warren supposes. It is waiting to be attacked and destroyed from outside. What lies outside imperialism is no longer the working classes of the home countries of imperialism, but those of the world outside their frontiers. A note on the primary commodities boom. Angus Hone, in his article The Primary Commodities Boom, is as optimistic about the Third World's terms of trade as Bill Warren is about its prospects for development. From my own point of view, however, there is an essential difference between them. Unlike Warren's positions, those of Hone do not conflict at any point with mine, for the simple reason that he and I have studied two different objects. What interested me in unequal exchange was abstract equilibrium prices of production, whereas Angus Hone is concerned with actual market prices in his article. For the price that he discusses to be an equilibrium price, it would be necessary, 1. That it be projected over a long period, and thus be more than just the effect of conjunctural speculation or extra-economic vicissitudes. Not only does Hone not claim this, but he explicitly admits 79. That an important element in the recent increase in prices has been speculative in character, a result of the erosion of currency values which makes investment in commodities a profitable hedge against future depreciation, and has brought about a stockpile of commodities in Japan. He even writes of waves of speculation. 26. He also ascribes many of the recent price rises either to political crises in the producing countries, as in the case of copper, or to natural calamities such as the droughts of 1972 and 1973, in the case of rice, sugar, cocoa, oils, eds, wool, sisal, and cotton. 2. It would also be necessary if equilibrium and market prices were to coincide, that the latter be related to conditions of production in such a way as to represent the ideal moment at which transfers of factors from one branch to another come to a halt. Angus Hone, however, acknowledges that present-day prices diverge considerably from the point of equilibrium. So far as oil is concerned, he points out that the real weakness of the OPEC countries is that the marginal cost of a barrel is between 10 and 20 cents, while as regards agricultural products, he notes that it will take 3 to 5 years for adjustments to be made on the production side. 27 This means that present prices are, in Hone's view, abnormal in the sense that they over-reward the producers, and are therefore liable to cause an inflow of factors into the branches concerned, which will increase production and result in halting price increases, even if only after a certain delay due to the specific period needed for investments in tropical agriculture to take effect. Since the long term exceeds, by definition, the time which elapses between the movement of factors and subsequent changes in production, this last remark of Hone's makes it clear that the prices with which he is concerned cannot be regarded as equilibrium prices. Not only, however, are the prices in question not long-term equilibrium prices of the factors of production, they are not always, in Angus Hone's account, even true momentary equilibrium prices of supply and demand, based on free confrontation between the latter on the market. Where oil is concerned, the situation is plain. Here we have an artificial increase due to political action by the OPEC countries. Hone adds the clear-sighted comment that any break in OPEC's united front would have the very serious consequences of causing a steep decline from the present floor of tax plus cost towards a price based on the marginal cost of production. 28 An explicit acknowledgement that the true equilibrium price is that which is determined by conditions of production. Even for the other traditional export products, however, Angus Hone ultimately puts his hope in international agreements between the producing states. This is sound. However conjunctural the recent price rises may be, they do provide the Third World with an opportunity for concerted political action that could consolidate some of its gains. But this possibility is, obviously, something that belongs outside the realm of economic laws. 26 NLR 81, pages 84 to 5. It is true that he goes on to say that the world stocks of all commodities in 1973 are low, which hardly squares with his earlier reference to a stockpile of commodities on P8427 IBID, P8628 IBID, P84, and 280. This is not all that needs to be said, though. Current prices not only are not prices of production, not only are they contingent and in part political in character, they are also not even entirely real. To some extent they are fictitious, for as Angus Hone admits, a significant portion of the boom is a purely nominal reflection of the fall in the value of the pound and the $29, the currencies in which the prices of the commodities in question are usually quoted. Angus Hone's analysis of the present conjuncture, and his market forecasts, thus constitute an important and interesting contribution in their own right, but they do not affect the theoretical foundations of unequal exchange. Having said this, however, two questions remain. 1. Whatever the origin of the recent spiraling of commodity prices, may not its very occurrence, however precarious in itself, shift the balance of political forces within the underdeveloped countries by widening the local margin for concessions by employers, and thus creating conditions for wage increases, which in their turn would render the present rise in prices permanent? In other words, might not future re-equilibrium be achieved, not by a realignment of prices downwards to previous costs, but by an inflation of costs upwards to present prices? 2. If the present prices increases were in one way or another consolidated at their current levels, would their incidence on the terms of trade amount to a significant modification of the economic relationships between the developed countries and the Third World? The first hypothesis leaves me very skeptical. Of course, it cannot a priori be excluded that the present disequilibrium may unleash a series of wage increases in the Third World which would reabsorb present price rises at the point of production. But although theoretically possible, this eventuality in practice seems very improbable. The current price increases are too unequally distributed from country to country and product to product, the margins for negotiation created by them are too temporary and erratic, the gains themselves too unexpected, to stimulate a real wave of generalized social struggles whose impetus could compensate for the weakness of the political and trade union structures, and the lack of coordination between the workers' movements, in countries competing with each other in the same product markets. In any case, nothing like this occurred at the time of the Korean War boom, the only serious historical precedent hitherto. However, so far as the second question is concerned, I would be rather inclined to answer it in the affirmative. Oil and other raw materials put together, the size of the windfall represented by the recent price increases in primary commodities is nearly $100 billion. Even if certain countries are not in a position, as we have said, to materialize their share, or can do so only partially, it is still true that the proportion of the total sum materialized will be of the order of several tens of billions of dollars. The significance of this figure cannot be dismissed, when it is remembered that the global foreign trade in both directions of the Third World was only some $63 billion in 1971. Moreover, even the proportion of the windfall that remains purely monetary and non-materialized, cannot fail to lead to serious perturbances in both the international monetary system and the balances of payments between the advanced countries themselves. The underdeveloped countries thus have every interest in seeking to consolidate the present situation by every possible means at their disposal. In the absence of domestic wage increases, they will doubtless try to use the shortcut of directly dirigiste methods such as export taxes or centralization of foreign trade, reinforced where possible by international agreements, to try and capture the difference between what international demand is capable of paying in each case, and what internal forces are at present content with receiving. 82.